Hi, and welcome back. In this portion of the Number Knowledge Test virtual training, we will spend time unpacking the flowchart, also called the Kindergarten Monitoring of Progress Guidelines. You will need the handout by the same name, Kindergarten Monitoring of Progress Guidelines, for this portion of the training. If you do not have a copy of this handout, please pause the presentation at this time and locate a copy. Copies of this handout can be found linked on the Blackboard site along with this training. At this portion of the training, please reference your flowchart handout, also called the Kindergarten Monitoring of Progress Guidelines. We're going to give you a few minutes to review the chart. You'll be doing this part independently. And as you review the chart, here's what I would like you to do. When you see things on the chart that you may have questions about, go ahead and write a question mark. When you see things that are exciting or interesting to you, please mark those with an exclamation mark. You may also use a highlighter to mark or indicate any portion of the handout that stands out to you or that you may have additional questions. Go ahead and mark your handout at this time. If you are completing this virtual training with a team, you may at this time go ahead and discuss the things that you mark with question marks or exclamation points. If you are completing this training independently, you may want to hold on to this handout and talk to other teammates or an IRT at a later time. Throughout this portion of the training, hopefully many of your questions will be answered, but if additional questions remain, please be sure to ask someone so that you are clear on the guidelines. Now, before we continue, I want to make sure we are clear on the three boxes across the bottom of your handout. Those would be the boxes that you see here, here, and here. When we're thinking about the colors that we mentioned earlier in the training, the green, the yellow, and the red, I want to take just a moment before we dig into this chart to talk about where those colors would fall in these boxes. Thinking about our yellow, this first box here would really be our yellow students. And then the box in the middle and the box on this side would be our red students. Please don't be tempted to label green, yellow, red. The first box would really be yellow students, and then the last two boxes would be our students that would be indicated in the red. I want to start first by exploring the idea of Tier 1. This is what should we be providing for all our students on a regular basis. First, we want to make sure we're using curriculum resources that are aligned to the standards, such as those found on CMAP. Using those resources, we want to make sure we're facilitating a differentiated core instruction that includes pieces like modeling, manipulatives, math talk, discourse, and we want that instruction to be happening for at least 60 minutes a day, even in kindergarten. Thinking about your work as a team, we want to make sure that you are trying to plan collaboratively with your teammates and working to administer common grade level assessments. By planning collaboratively and giving a common assessment to our students, that allows you as a team to discuss the fidelity of your core instruction when you're meeting with a PLT. Since you'll be giving the number knowledge test 3 times throughout the year, that can be one point of data that you use to discuss. When thinking about the information garnered from your number knowledge test, remember you're thinking about that 80%. We want at least 80% of your class to make sure they have met the benchmark. Don't forget, though, that we also want to be looking at that 80% of each of our subgroups. So, for example, let's say that 85% of your class met the benchmark, but only 65% of your Hispanic students met the benchmark. You would want to dig deeper and have some discussions about what can you do to make sure that 80% of each of your subgroups as well are meeting the benchmark. Let's take a look at what we should do if less than 80% of the students in your classroom are indicated as being proficient using the number knowledge test. The first thing we want to think about doing is adjust our core teaching practices and our instructional strategies. I want to be clear that that does not mean we are changing the content that we are teaching students. Especially in kindergarten, we know that students need ample time and lots of repetition when dealing with number concepts. The majority of our lessons in our kindergarten pacing guide deal with number and number concepts. They are scaffolded to work with more complex numbers and number strategies as the year progresses, but focusing on number, counting, and cardinality are key points throughout the kindergarten curriculum. If less than 80% of the students in your class are proficient according to the beginning of year or end of year assessment, You will want to take a look at the teaching practices that you're using during that 60 minutes. You'll want to ask yourself questions such as, are my students really getting the full minutes of instruction? Are my students having lots of opportunities to work with manipulatives during that time? Are there opportunities for collaboration, partner work? Are my students having opportunity to share their thinking? Just a few of the things to revisit as you think about what might be happening or what you may be able to change during your core instruction. The next step would be thinking about how to provide that supplemental instruction through reteaching. If we have students that we know are not meeting the cut score, let's say during our middle of year administration, we'll want to make sure that they receive additional time learning number concepts. Now that reteaching is key, but it should not be happening in the 60 minutes of math instruction. In order for students to receive the additional time they need, we want that time to be outside of the 60 minutes. If you do not have intervention time built into your master schedule for kindergarten, you will want to talk to your IRT or administrator on how you can perhaps change the schedule to include a little bit of time each week or several times a week to allow kids the time they need for that additional practice. Now, our next step would be to use the identified scores as indicators for our next step of digging deeper. Remember, if a student receives the intervention, it should be in addition to the tier core instruction that we talked about before. So let's go ahead and move to the next box on our flowchart. On the screen in front of you and on your handout, you will see the beginning of year and middle of year cut scores for the number knowledge test. These cut scores were established looking at our pacing and our expectations for kindergarten, as well as the research behind how we know kindergarten students grow and develop. So let's dig into the cut scores now. Based on experiences that students have received through the daily routines and the math lessons provided on CMAT, and also looking at the pacing guide, the cut scores listed on this slide were developed. Thinking about beginning of year, students who score a 6 or greater would not necessarily need any intervention. And middle of year, students scoring a 9 and greater would not necessarily need any intervention. It is important to note, though, that a student who is scoring close to the cut score mark may require some extra practice so that they don't slide below the cut score for the next administration. So thinking about beginning of year, these would be your students who scored a 6. And thinking about your mid-year, these may be students who scored a 9. If you are concerned about a student on the cusp, please feel free to include them in supplemental instruction and allow them opportunities to be retaught as well. Now let's talk about those students who did not quite make the cut score. Thinking about students who scored a 5 or below at the beginning of year and an 8 or below at the mid-year. What are we going to do for these students? Well, this is where you're going to be using your AMC resources, Assessing Math Concepts. Your students who score a 5 or below for beginning of year and an 8 or below for middle year should be given the Counting Objects Assessment by logging on to the AMC Anywhere website and starting the assessment at number 7. In this training, we will not dig into how to use Assessing Math Concepts, but there is virtual training available for you on how to access Assessing Math Concepts and digging deeper into practicing using those assessments for students. You will want to refer to your linking assessment to instruction document to understand where students will align with their levels, I, P, and N. Again, we're not going to dig into that today, but just so you know, that resource is also available for you. As you're thinking about using these assessments, you'll want to monitor students every 3 to 4 weeks using the Counting Objects Assessment. Once students have accomplished a level A in all 4 of the tasks, as referenced at the bottom of this screen, and that would be in the Counting Objects Assessment, then you have an opportunity to move on to the Changing Number Assessment as well. You again would want to monitor students' progress every 3 to 4 weeks using the Changing Number Assessment. There are many assessments available in the AMC, Assessing Math Concepts resources, but for kindergarten students, we will only be administering the Counting and Changing Numbers assessments. Now we're going to take a moment to dig back in and practice figuring out where some students might be, thinking about their cut scores and what we know. I want you to think back to the training you did online where we watched students' videos and we practiced giving them assessments. You may remember Levy. Levy was a young man that you had an opportunity to virtually watch him and practice giving his assessment. Thinking about Levy, Levy scored a 5 on the number knowledge test beginning of year assessment. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause this video and use your Monitoring of Progress guidelines to discuss what you would do for Levi if he was your student. If you are watching this video with a group, feel free to discuss this as a group. If you are watching this video independently, you can have a reflection time to decide what you would do. So let's think about Levi. What would we do with Levi if he was our student? Well, we know that Levi did not make the cut score for his number knowledge test beginning of year assessment. So that means that Levi is going to need some additional intervention and practice to make sure that he doesn't fall behind in his understanding of number and number concepts. We may want to consider giving Levi the AMC assessment, counting numbers, and seeing if that can give us some further information about where Levi needs additional practice. Most importantly, it is essential that Levi receives additional intervention time outside of his core math instruction. Now let's take a moment to remember Jackson. You may remember that Jackson had a pretty big personality in our videos we watched earlier, even if he didn't always get the right answers. Now thinking about Jackson, he scored a 10 on his NKT BOY assessment, just as we did with Levi. Pause the video at this time and discuss with your group or reflect independently what you might do with Jackson if he was your student. Thinking about Jackson, we know that he scored a 10 on the number knowledge test beginning of year assessment, which is above the cut score. That means that at this time, Jackson would not need additional intervention. It does mean, however, that Jackson would continue with his core instruction. As a teacher, I might also want to go back through the number knowledge test interview and see if there were any pieces that I felt Jackson might need some additional support in, even though he wasn't flagged as having any issues with his cut score. In closing for this portion of our virtual training, it's important that you stay familiar with your Kindergarten Monitoring of Progress guidelines. This document can be found online on the Blackboard course, or IRTs also have access to it in their IRT wiki. This concludes this portion of the Number Knowledge Test virtual training. Thank you.